On the record in the matter of State of Utah versus MacNeill, he is present with his counsel. The state's attorneys are present, and we are outside the presence of the jury. Prior to the objection, Dr. Perper was beginning to give testimony regarding the dilution of various chemicals in the blood. The objection was made. I held a bench conference, then dismissed the jury to allow a proffer to be made of Dr. Perper's testimony. Dr. Perper would testify that 3 blood tests are available for review in this case. One in January of 2003, the second immediately prior to Michelle MacNeill's death, I believe 8 days, or well, it's March 30th, 2007, and the third blood test, April 11th of 2007. He would testify that the first 2 tests conducted prior to death were congruent and stable. There was no variation in the composition of the blood or in the elements of the blood. However, the post-mortem blood test demonstrated a decline in some elements of the blood that would not be attributable to resuscitation efforts. The defense objects to this testimony on the ground that the state did not provide fair notice that Dr. Perper would testify regarding the dilution of the chemical components in Michelle MacNeill's blood. The alternative ground for objection is that Dr. Perper's analysis or methodology is not generally accepted in the scientific community. As to the notice question, this is an issue governed by statute. If the prosecution intends to call an expert at trial, it is required to give pretrial notice. The notice must be such that the expert's proposed testimony, the notice must include a written explanation of the expert's proposed testimony sufficient to give the opposing party adequate notice to prepare to meet the testimony. In addition, the state must make the expert available to cooperatively consult with opposing counsel. In this case, Dr. Perper did issue a written report and has been made available after the preliminary hearing to cooperatively consult with defense counsel. The statute goes on to provide that testimony of an expert at a preliminary hearing held pursuant to the rules of criminal procedure constitutes notice of the expert's qualifications, and a report of the expert's proposed trial testimony as to the subject matter testified to by the expert at the preliminary hearing. Finally, even where the state fails to substantially comply with the requirements of the statute, the remedy is not exclusion of the testimony, but rather to prevent substantial prejudice, the opposing party may be entitled to a continuance of the trial sufficient to allow preparation to meet the testimony. I've taken a recess to review the report of Dr. Perper as well as the preliminary hearing testimony. I agree generally, I think, with the state's position that Dr. Perper's report does not give adequate notice of this issue. However, having reviewed the preliminary hearing testimony, I am satisfied that notice has been given sufficient to give the defendant adequate opportunity to prepare to meet this testimony. I reached that conclusion based on pages 1455 through 1476 of the preliminary hearing transcript, where Dr. Perper clearly addresses the issue of dilution of what he refers to as various components, chemical components of the blood, including potassium, glucose, examine whether or not the defendant had adequate time to prepare, given a continuance or something else. I have not excluded experts from listening to these proceedings. The state's case has not been concluded at this point. In my view, Mr. MacNeill has ample opportunity to prepare to meet the testimony through his experts, who I'm sure are watching the proceedings. As to turning to the second component of the defendant's objection, that Dr. Perper's methodology is not generally accepted, this is an objection to foundation. I agree that insufficient foundation has been laid at this point for the methodology that he is using, and frankly, I don't think the state's done with that. And so the objection as to foundation is sustained. You may lay further foundation for the methodology Dr. Perper used in examining the chemical composition of human blood for dilution. Let's have the jury back. Is Dr. Perper here? Yes. Sir, if you'll retake the witness stand, please. Thank you very much. Please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Sometimes issues arise at trial that require me to take some more time. I've done my best to limit those delays as best I can, but I appreciate your patience. You may continue your examination.
Dr. Perper, I think before we recessed, you were referring to, I think, you were referring to some lab results.
Correct.
With respect to Michelle MacNeill. And I believe I asked you if you found those lab results helpful in your determination that Michelle MacNeill died as a result of drowning. Is that where we were in the testimony?
Yes.
Do you recall? Okay. Will you just first indicate, there were three different lab results. What's the dates on those results?
Sure.
Before we get into the content or substance of them.
Sure. There were 3 dates of those results. The first one was January the 22nd, 2003. The second one was March the 30th, 2007. and the third was April the 11th, 2007.
Okay. Generally speaking, what is the significance between the significance of having those two previous reports, the dates, and comparing them to the April 11th, 2007?
The significance is that both the reports address the composition of the blood and the blood chemistry. And comparing those from 2003 and 2007, eight days prior to her demise, give a look or an insight whether there were changes in those different values between 2003 and 2007. And there were none.
With respect to, would it be fair to say that the two previous dates and the results from those lab reports provide a baseline?
Correct. Especially the one which was 8 days prior to her demise.
And why is it important to have a baseline?
Well, the importance of the baseline is that if there are any kind of changes on the next date, what is the explanation for those changes? In this particular case, it's an instance of drowning, and as I explained before, drowning is associated with the inhalation of large amounts of water which enter the blood, and therefore there is dilution of the blood. In addition, in this case, we know that she received water fluids of about 20% of her total blood volume. So therefore, the blood elements, both the red blood cells and the chemical elements, would have to be diluted by a corresponding 20%. Mathematically, it's 17%, but it doesn't matter. For purposes of practical evaluation, we can assume that there was a dilution by 20%. Therefore, if between those two dates, 8 days before the demise and the time when she was brought to the hospital unconscious and apparently deceased, if there is a dilution by 20%, then the entire dilution can be attributed to the infusion of fluids which she received therapeutically. If there is a significant dilution beyond that, does it mean that this additional dilution had to come from no other place from the inhalation of fluid of water which she inhaled?
Is your analysis that you've just described to come to some opinions and some results, is this generally accepted in the scientific community?
Absolutely. What physicians do in hospital constantly, they monitor changes in the blood composition and in blood chemistry during hospitalization or even during regular treatment in their office.
And those changes can be attributed to resuscitation efforts as far as or fluids being introduced to the body?
In this particular case. In other cases, the changes are due to various other processes, disease, which affect the concentration in the previous test.
What are other processes that can affect the concentration or the dilution?
Besides dilution?
Or, what about in the case of a drowning? Can a drowning affect dilution of substances in the blood?
Yes.
And how so?
Well, there are elements in which the additional water is going, the excess of the water beyond any kind of therapeutic administration of fluid. This excess of water would further dilute the blood. Therefore, there will be elements of the blood which would be much less diluted than their presence at the time when she was brought to the hospital unconscious, practically dead. For example, in this, as I said before, because of the water which she inhaled was which was administered therapeutically, about 20%. So, for example, the concentration of the protein, that's basically protein, it's albumin, it's a kind of chemical in the blood. This protein was 4 grams per cent 8 days before her demise. When she was brought to the hospital, it was cut by twice. It's about 2 grams per cent. Therefore, a decline from 4 to 2 is a decline by 50%. So it's a decline which well exceeds the amount of fluid which she received therapeutically, which the decline should have been only 20%. Some elements of the blood were again very much diluted. For example, thrombocytes, which were 8 days before her demise, 400,000, declined after the time when she was brought to the hospital with only 80,000, which is well in excess, it's almost 70–80%. There were therefore elements in the blood which were markedly diluted. There were some elements in the blood which were not diluted and theoretically could have been diluted. For example, sodium 8 days before and at the time when she was brought to the hospital was about the same, not much of a change, but she received sodium bicarbonate as a resuscitation, and therefore this explains this increase. The same thing applies to calcium, which should have been diluted, but the calcium was elevated, and the reason was elevated again for the reason that she received therapeutically significant amount of calcium. So in addition to the red blood cells, the hemoglobin decreased by 33%, which, if it would have been just due to therapy, would have decreased only by about 20%. So those are basically the changes which occur as a result of the inhalation of fluid, and there was a decrease in concentration of different elements in the blood, as I explained, well beyond what you would expect from the infusion of fluids.
Okay. And the inhalation of water is the drowning?
Yes.
Okay. Can you explain just the process of how someone inhales water? How does the water then get into the bloodstream?
When a person inhales water, it means it doesn't swallow water. It means that water goes into the airway. When it goes into the airway, it goes through the different tubes in the airway, which are called bronchi, and eventually it ends water filling the air chambers, which we call them the alveoli. Now, the air chambers are like this room, except that the walls of those air chambers are extremely thin, and in those walls of the alveoli of the air chambers, there are very fine blood vessels, extremely thin, which are called capillaries. They are so thin that only one red blood cell can flow through them at a time. Because of the difference in concentration between the water in the air chambers and the fluid in the blood vessels, water rushes from the air chambers through the walls, which are so thin, into the blood, which is traveling into the blood vessel inside the wall of the air chambers, and from there it's go into the general circulation and dilutes the entire system of blood.
With respect to the issue of dilution, and you're aware that Michelle MacNeill, that there were certain controlled substances, narcotics, that were found in her blood at the time of autopsy.
Yes.
Correct? Do you have an opinion as to how dilution would affect those drugs?
Those would be equally diluted, with the exception that I cannot say what's the percentage of the dilution, because I don't know what was their original concentration in the blood. For the other elements which I mentioned, I have the data from the hospital 8 days before. So, and those data were stable, so I can evaluate the percentage of concentration which varied from 33% to 50% and more. But I don't know what was the concentration of the drugs in Michelle at the time when the drowning occurred. So I can say that there was dilution, but I cannot make any statements about the magnitude of the dilution.
And if there is dilution of the controlled substances in the blood, well, I'll move on from there. Thank you. Are there other factors that you looked at on Michelle that indicate drowning here?
Yes.
What are those?
The other factors is, as I indicated, I think in my prior direct testimony, the fact that during the resuscitation process, when the chest of Michelle was compressed for resuscitation purposes, there was a regurgitation of a significant amount of water, and as I understand from the testimony which was given by the police officer who did the initial resuscitation, there were about first 4 cups of water and then additional 3 cups of water, which means that it was about 4 cups is about a liter, so it was about a liter and 3/4, which would be about somewhat less than half a gallon of fluid. That's a large amount of fluid. In addition to that, when she was brought to the hospital, the airway was drained and there was additional fluid which was tinged with water, and it was partly foamy because of combination of water, blood, and air.
Thank you. And we did cover that earlier this morning. Thank you. With respect to the lungs, the weight of the lungs, is that significant?
Yeah, the lungs was increased. I believe it was about 1,360 grams or 1,300 grams, and should have been about half of it if there would be no congestion or no water. The pathologist, the initial medical examiner who performed the autopsy, mentions that the lungs were well aerated. Well aerated means that the air was present in the air chambers and there was nothing in them. But his statement is basically contradicted by the fact that water and water tinged with blood was present in the airway and therefore had to occlude the airway. In addition to that, there's an increase in the weight of the lungs because of the congestion, significant amount of blood expanding the blood vessel. But in addition to that, he made also determination that there was moderate pulmonary edema. Now, pulmonary edema means that's fluid in the air chambers. Air chambers which contain fluid, by definition, are not well aerated. However, when he described the microscopic findings, and the microscopic findings were also described by Dr. Gray, they did not see any kind of fluid in the lungs. And the reason for that is usually in people who have heart disease or die with pulmonary edema, the water which comes from the blood is also partly tinged with protein. And therefore, when you look microscopically in the lung, you can see that the alveoli contain a reddish and eosinophilic, that's the pathological term, which indicates that there was protein which came out of the blood vessel in the wall together with the water. And therefore, you can make a determination when you see that this person had pulmonary edema. If there's only water there, water is transparent, you cannot see anything. So in this particular case, now I cannot exclude that part of the pure water which was in the lungs was coming from pulmonary edema from the blood vessel, it seems in the view of the drowning that certainly some amount, if not a substantial amount, of the so-called pulmonary edema can be accounted on the basis of the inhalation of water.
Your examination of the lungs and the microscopic slides of the lungs,
Yes.
Support a finding of drowning.
Yes.
With respect to, just discuss briefly the issue of an arrhythmia. What is an arrhythmia?
An arrhythmia is an irregular rhythm of the heart, when for various reasons the heart can beat in an abnormal way. Sometimes people can feel that, like a rushing of the heart or suddenly irregular beating. Sometimes they cannot, and the only way to document it clinically is through an electrocardiogram, which shows that certain heartbeats are skipped or missing, or that the general pattern of the beating of the heart is irregular. Now, in this particular case, there is no clinical evidence that she experienced skip beats of the heart. There was no evidence which I saw of any electrocardiographic tracing, and there were a couple of them which showed the irregularity of the rhythm. However, as I showed you before, there were scarring in the heart, small scars in the heart, scattered in the heart, and there was also hypertension. And both can be associated with arrhythmia. Therefore, this is a possibility which exists, but I cannot verify it and I cannot deny it.
How would you diagnose, and first of all, can an arrhythmia cause death?
Yes, if it's a certain type of arrhythmia, particularly what we call ventricular arrhythmia, which are coming from the lower chambers of the heart, those are very dangerous and they can result in death, yes.
Is a pathologist able to diagnose an arrhythmia as a cause of death?
The pathologist usually cannot diagnose arrhythmia as a cause of death, because once a person is dead, there is no more beating of the heart, and you cannot establish an irregular beating of the heart. He can presume arrhythmia in certain type of death. If somebody, for example, is found dead and he has moderate heart disease or moderate sclerosis of the artery of the heart, he doesn't have, or he may have some scarring in the heart. He doesn't have evidence of what we call mechanical failure of the heart, such as congestion of the heart failure cells in the lungs. Then he can reasonably conclude that this individual, which the cause of death would be coronary artery disease, that the likely mechanism of death was an arrhythmia, based on the lack of mechanical failure. That's not mathematical, but it's a reasonable conclusion.
How would that approach to an arrhythmia apply here to Michelle MacNeill?
To Michelle MacNeill, as I said, the presence of the focal myocardial scarring, which I mentioned, and the presence of hypertension can have triggered an arrhythmia, which, as I say, I cannot confirm it. We didn't have prior evidence of arrhythmia documented clinically or on electrocardiogram, but I cannot deny that this might have happened. But by the same token, there is no way which I can confirm it.
With respect to the other findings on Michelle, in particular the lungs and so forth, do you have an opinion as to whether or not arrhythmia was the mechanism of death?
As I said, it could have, there's no, arrhythmia means that the heart beats irregularly. In order to be able to say that, you have to have a beating heart. Obviously, the person who doesn't have a beating heart at the time of the examination you cannot make a determination of arrhythmia. Of an individual who died with heart disease but doesn't have evidence of mechanical failure of the heart, then you can reasonably conclude that the mechanism of death was a fatal arrhythmia. Okay. Now, in the case of Michelle, it's possible that she had an arrhythmia with the proviso which I mentioned, but there's no way for me to prove or to deny that.
Okay. With respect to drowning as the cause of death of Michelle, how confident are you in your opinion? How certain? How certain are you in your opinion?
My opinion is within a reasonable degree of medical certainty and beyond, because the elements which I mentioned and the dilution of the blood cannot be explained. She lost her hemoglobin, for example, went from 15 gram to 10 gram %, which means by a third. The total volume of blood is about 6 liters, which means that theoretically she would have lost correspondingly about 2 liters of blood. She didn't have any anemia at the time when she was tested 8 days before she died. If this would have been due to a loss of blood during those 8 days, there would have to be clinical symptoms of that, and there were none. So the only explanation of that is dilution of the blood. In addition to that, as a result of drowning, there is a mechanism which I not mentioned, because the blood basically has a concentration which is similar to that of saline. Red blood cells maintain their shape in saline, but if you add water, they can break down on what's called a process which is called hemolysis. And when they break down, they release their content, so the hemoglobin doesn't change, but the number of red blood cells changes, and the potassium, which is an element which is present in the blood, can increase, and that is the explanation for the rise in potassium. I cannot exclude that the rise in potassium, which was very high, was also due to administration of potassium, but I cannot conclude positively because of that, because of this mechanism of breakdown of red blood cell, which can cause increased potassium.
Thank you, Doctor. We've talked a lot about the cause of Michelle's death due to the drowning. Did you form an opinion as to the manner of her death?
No, I did not form an opinion on the manner of the death. And I mentioned that the manner of death is undetermined. I mentioned this at my report. I mentioned this at the preliminary hearing, and I mentioned it today. As I said in my report, there were a lot of suspicious elements in my evaluation of the records which were given to me, but I did not have the opportunity of examining the witnesses myself.
Sustained.
Okay. Can you describe why you made the determination that her manner of death is undetermined, as opposed to attributing it to an accident or?
Because I don't have testimony which is fully validated by me after hearing the entire testimony provided and the entire evidence provided to reach this conclusion.
Okay. You mentioned, as far as publications, that you have authored a book entitled When Doctors Kill, Who, Why, and How.
Yes.
Are doctors unique in their ability to commit homicide?
Objection, Your Honor. I don't think that there could possibly be, well, I'm sorry.
What's your objection?
Foundation, relevance. 403, 404.
I can lay foundation as to.
Okay, that's one problem. Come on up. The objection is sustained.
Dr. Perper, a question about core body temperature in relationship to helping a crime scene investigator or a pathologist or an emergency room doctor to help determine the time of death. Is core body temperature of a deceased person helpful in determining the time of death?
It can help in the determination of the time of death. That the time of death is not an exact determination. It's an evaluation based on different criteria. In this particular case, the post-mortem interval is very short. In other words, part of it is short because there was a telephone at about 8:45 in the morning, which Michelle responded, and she was found dead at about 11:30. So there's already a time interval which is well known that this was the only time interval where the death could have occurred, and not prior to that particular day on April 11, not prior to 8:30. So the question is, between 8:39 and 11:30 is about 2.5 hours. The question is, when during this interval of time did the drowning occur and she died? Now, at the time when she was examined at the hospital, her body temperature was about 1 degree Celsius less than the normal body temperature, which is about 36.7, 37 degrees Celsius. This was about 1 degree below. Now, the loss of temperature of the body after death depends on a variety of elements. It depends on the temperature of the body at the time when the person died. It depends on the environmental temperature. The environmental temperature has to be lower than the temperature of the body in order for the temperature of the body to drop. It depends also on other elements to which the body was exposed. If the body was in warm water, then the changes in the temperature of the body are going to be affected by that. If the water is warm, then the drop is going to be less. If the water is cold, the drop is going to be faster. So there are a number of elements which determine that. Besides that, they have found out that the...
Objection, Your Honor, non-responsive.
Sustained.
Okay. There are a number of factors.
There are a number of factors. There is a pattern of the drop in the temperature, which we call it a sigmoid pattern. In other words, at the beginning, we have a plateau in which the temperature stays about the same. Then the temperature starts to drop gradually slower, and then a little bit more. So in this particular time, according to what is known on average, the plateau can be somewhere between 20 minutes, 30 minutes, sometimes it may be a little longer. Usually the drop in temperature immediately after death is about 1 degree Celsius per hour. So according to that, assuming that all those factors were taken in consideration, she would die within 1 hour prior to being discovered, but it can be more. It can be 1.5 hours, it can be 2 hours. There's no way of determining that. In addition to that, when she was examining at the scene, they did not pay attention whether she had post-mortem lividity.
Your Honor, there's been testimony about that, and he's speculating, stating facts that aren't in evidence.
Sustained. Go ahead.
Your Honor, I will pass the witness at this point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It'll be an hour or so. Would you like to break at 1 or noon today? You say 1. What's that? You'd like to break soon? Okay. Let's break for lunch then. We'll come back at 1 o'clock. Remember, don't talk to anybody about the case amongst yourselves, anyone else. Don't form or express any opinion about the case. Avoid news coverage. Do no research on your own. Court's in recess.